I am Andrew Weissman. I'm a professor at NYU School of Law. I'm co-host of the Main Justice podcast, but that is not why we're here. We are here to celebrate and have a long discussion with Carol Leonnig and Aaron Davis in connection with their new book, The Indispensable Injustice. This is a wonderful book. The subtitle is How Politics and Fear Vanquished America's Justice Department. So there is a lot to talk about. For those of you who are listening in, you probably know Carol and Aaron, but just in case you don't, Carol is a senior investigative correspondent at MSNBC. We're so happy to have her. I am an MSNBC legal analyst. She is a five-time Pulitzer Prize winner, and she spent 25 years at the Washington Post. Aaron Davis is no slouch either. He is a mere two Pulitzer Prize winning awards, and he has also spent many, many years at the Washington Post. I have joked with both of them that they really need to learn to share because they have just way too many Pulitzers. But if you know either of them, you know how well deserved it is. And this book is no exception. It is something that I devoured. It is a really amazing read. I know it took an enormous amount of time, and it really, really shows. So I'm very, very happy to be able to do this, and I look forward to our discussion. So Carol and Aaron, welcome.
Andrew, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this.
Aaron, Carol, tell me, what if you had to sort of give a synopsis, what's the book about? What were you trying to accomplish here? What should readers expect if they were, getting this for the first time and turning the pages?
I hate to start on a grim note, but Aaron and I have often described this book to each other as a sort of tragedy in three acts. We are trying to explain to people a venerable institution and how it began to suffer from political attacks and how it was, if not sabotaged, definitely undermined by its own investigators and agents' fears and worries and anxieties about politics. It's about how what we're watching today, the unraveling of the Justice Department by Donald Trump, really began 10 years ago in his first presidency in the way that his bare knuckle assaults landed the kinds of blows and scars that we only really started to appreciate when we dug in to this reporting for the book.
Yeah, so I was really struck by that because you really start in what I call sort of Trump 1.0. And it seems necessary to understand that time period because it seems like the heart of the book is really exploring what happened during the Biden administration and what steps were taken and what steps, maybe more importantly, were not taken. And maybe the only way to understand that was to understand the history that happened during Trump 1.0. Does that seem fair in terms of like the trajectory of the book, in terms of what you were trying to explain?
I'd definitely say that's a good read. And the reason we do start back then and Trump 1.0, if you will, is that Carol and I started working on some of this reporting 2-3 years ago. And some people would come to us and say, you just don't understand how much of what happened in what is happening now back then is because of where they had been before January 6th. And so when we set out to do the long tail here, we wanted to really try to find the right point to start with. And, one of the things we definitely wanted to answer was, what was the condition of the Department of Justice when the sun came up on the morning of January 6th, before anything happened that day? How prepared was it for what was about to transpire? And to do that, we really had to back another couple of years before that to, there's a lot of things, of course, that happened in Trump's first term. And there was, all of the, to taking kids away from parents at the border and those kind of things that happened on the civil side very early on. But we really focused about halfway through Trump's term when he's really pushing for the prosecution of Andrew McCabe, who's just the outgoing deputy director of the FBI. Andrew McCabe had been the one who'd actually signed the beginning of the investigation into Trump and whether his firing of his predecessor Comey is supposed to, obstruction of justice kind of probe, and so we really started there because it puts the prosecutors and the FBI agents in an incredible position of deciding: do we go forward with this prosecution? Is there enough here on the merits to go forward? And what do we do about a president sitting here telling us he should be found guilty?
Let me actually, in light of that answer, Aaron, let me ask both of you this question about January 6th. And it's one I thought about prior to reading your book, but given all of your I just want to make sure people understand the remarkable sources. I mean, this book is so rich in details and in scoops, and being able to be in the room. But in thinking about January 6th, I was always very torn in my own head as to the FBI and the sort of government response. I think about the FBI because I'd been at the FBI, but writ large, the response was not what I think anyone would have thought was the way that the government should have responded on that day and prepared. And do you attribute that to this sort of scarring and the experience that the Department of Justice, and people should know the FBI is part of the Department of Justice, had in the first Trump administration? Do you think it was just sort of an intelligence failure in terms of not really understanding these groups well? Do you think, as some people have suggested, because of the differential in terms of how that day was treated and how Black Lives Matter protests were treated a few months earlier, that there was either conscious or unconscious racism? I mean, how do you sort of assess that? Or, I mean, do you now see it through the lens of the scarring, or is that just perhaps one contributing factor?
My answer there, Andrew, and Aaron, it'd be great if he jumped in too, but my answer there is it's kind of a two-pronged answer. One, there clearly was a Department of Justice and an FBI a little bit on their back foot, in the sense that now we know, and now through our book reporting, we know a lot more detail, that as the FBI is walking towards January 6th, they are seeing, or they should be seeing, and we know from their emails they were seeing, a domestic terror plot in the making. And they concluded that it was, most of the sources we talked to, they concluded, well, these are just white pro-Trump people, and that's very unlikely that these people are going to be anti-blue, anti-cop. They never imagined that when these people said, let's gather guns at this way station and let's figure out how to get guns into Washington and let's take out the police if we need to make sure that Donald Trump is crowned the future president, they never imagined that that was real. But on the back foot point, so I wouldn't say necessarily racism, but I would say definitely the opposite of how the FBI responds to Islamic online discussion about potential violence. You know, your co-host, I think you know this well, but the book really goes into a lot of detail. Your co-host on Main Justice, Mary McCord, seasoned national security acting assistant attorney general at DOJ for exactly this kind of terror threat. And she is privately at that point warning the FBI. And we find that her warnings basically got put in a closet. Nobody at the FBI acted on them. And she wasn't the only one.
Can I just interrupt you there? I just want to make sure people understand that you have, in this book, you detail the people who were warning the FBI, including Mary McCord, who had been the head of the National Security Division at the Department of Justice. She is now in the private sector, but she is alerting people, including in writing, as to what she is seeing. But she's not the only one.
No.
Saying that you need to, heads up, this is real. You need to be ready. And your book details just how that is dropped
Discounted,
And
entirely shelved. I mean, even Parler, a forum for this kind of militant and violent, potentially criminal talk. An executive at Parler calls the FBI not long after Mary is reaching out to her contact. So there's this very different reaction than there would have been to Islamic radicalization or scary sounding conversation, either on the dark web or in open settings. But then the other thing, Andrew, that Aaron and I found was, and this is the second answer, is the FBI had a director who had been told to lay low because Donald Trump can't wait to fire you. Chris Wray and Bill Barr had a very good working relationship. Bill Barr, then the Attorney General, or until late December, and Bill Barr had basically said, Chris Wray, try to stay out of his way because I'm your heat shield to keep him from firing you over various people that you've investigated in the Russia probe. And so Chris Wray is not looking to throw himself forward. And now we also know that 3 days before January 6th, while all these violent threats are being fomented online and on the dark web, Donald Trump has almost decapitated his Department of Justice by threatening to remove his acting attorney general and install a compliant lieutenant who's willing to challenge and throw questions into the election and try to cast it into doubt so that the certification on January 6th can't happen. So everybody's like in a maelstrom at the same time that the FBI would normally be doing a joint task force on what in the world is about to happen on our Capitol.
Yeah, I would just
I'd like
pile
to
on there
stay
and
with
say,
the same. Sorry, go ahead.
oh, just to add a couple of things there. The security failure before January 6th by the FBI is really stunning. And it's not a failure of intelligence. They had gobs of intelligence. Then they had all kinds of people coming at them and telling them, there's this fuel fusion center system that was built after 9/11. And a couple days before January 6th, one of the heads in the Fusion Center in San Francisco actually calls another one in DC, and they're talking about everything that they're seeing. They're like, we should just have a nationwide call and have everybody talk about this, anybody who's seeing things. And they open a call to anybody, and they have like 400 people get on this call from all the fusion centers, and everybody's like, we're all seeing the same thing. Like every light is blinking red on the system before January 6th. And the FBI really does not take the initiative at that point in time. In fact, they are absent. Their liaison to that fusion center in DC is not even attending those meetings or listening to those calls. And then, there's a posture also that the FBI was in so many ways waiting for Donald Trump to leave office. The deputy director had already taken a job with Disney. Everybody was waiting for the next president to come in. And there was also just a failure that comes into play again later we can talk about, but the failure to just believe that people are going to do what they say they're going to do. And, that's just something we see now online that is new to this era.
One of the things that struck me as a lawyer, including having been a lawyer at the FBI, is that after the fact, when there were questions raised, one of the defenses to the inaction was that we couldn't do anything because it would infringe on the First Amendment, that this is mere speech. And one, I think it's lovely to see the FBI concerned about that, and they should be concerned about it. And there are rules about when you can consider speech and when you cannot. But that is actually an incorrect reading of the internal FBI rules, which I know very well, and I teach them. That excuse that this was protected because it was solely First Amendment activity is wrong, any more than if somebody, to give a quick example, if somebody said, I'm going to rob a bank in the future with Carol and Aaron, you wouldn't say, I can't investigate that because that person's speaking. And so they're obviously, that's a gross example, but that excuse didn't explain the answer to sort of why do we see such inaction. I did want to focus, though, on the same time period when we're talking about this sort of December to January 6th time period. just as we're getting to what is normally the peaceful transfer of power. I wanted to mention two names that, Kate, were in your book and ask you to describe who they are and what you report, because this is just one example of the truly extraordinary reporting in this book. And I lived through some of the events and I was going, wow. I mean, there was very much news to me about what you had uncovered. So the two names, and I'm sorry if I'm butchering them, Waleska McClellan and Miriam Vincent. And I thought it keeps us in the same time frame, but then I think moves us to the Biden administration and the sort of action and inaction that you report on. But who are those two individuals? What were they seeing and doing at or around this time?
I have so many reactions to what you just said, Andrew. One is, audience, it's a huge honor to be at the Commonwealth, but it's a huge honor as well to have Andrew Weissman say that the book had information he didn't know. The guy knows everybody in the Department of Justice. And so it's delightful to know our reporting was that revelatory. Also, you should be a composer, Andrew, because that's a beautiful bridge between part one and part two. Waleska McClellan is a investigator in a little known office that rarely rises into the national headlines, the Office of Inspector General for the National Archives. Miriam Vincent is a Georgetown law grad who has devoted her career at this point to representing the National Archives and making sure the law is properly followed in terms of preserving records, but especially election era records, which the archives has a huge responsibility for. The archives receives the certificates from every state in the election. And she comes to the National Archives investigators, Waleska and her boss, and says, just want to alert you, we are now at number 5, number 6, number 7 of receiving fraudulent, phony certificates that clearly look very similar to one another, and they allege falsely that these states voted for Donald Trump when we know that these swing states voted for Biden. These are not coming to us from the Secretary of State, and these are the names of the Republican officials who signed off and claimed falsely again that they were electors from their state sworn in as them. And Waleska McClellan begins looking at this and thinking, I don't really have a lot of experience with this, but it sure looks like at a minimum what mail or wire fraud. These people are pretending to be something they aren't in a federal election. And that could be a state crime. That could be a federal crime. She confers in late December of 2020 with the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C., federal prosecutors who work for the Department of Justice in that field office, if you will, a very important satellite office for the Department of Justice. And the prosecutors there are like, yeah, we'll keep talking to you. And on January 8th, 2 days after the riot, those prosecutors are slammed. They're completely swamped. And they get back to Waleska McClellan and say, we don't see the crime here. We're kind of busy. Talk later. So that is the first attempt by someone. And it starts December 19th, 2020. That's the first attempt by someone in a federal law enforcement role to say, there's something criminal. I suspect there's something criminal here in the election effort of this team.
I mean, to me, that, we just talked about dots that were sort of not connected and missed when we were talking about the heads up people were giving with respect to the January 6th insurrection. And here you have people who are clearly focusing on and early on the documents that they see and they say there's something wrong here because these are false. I mean, leave aside intent, whether it's intentional or not, they look at them and say these are not correct. They are not what the vote was. And what was surprising to me is I think this is the first reporting of even early on, this was being brought to the attention of the Department of Justice and then dropped. This is one where the Department of Justice like to say we need all to find a needle in the haystack, we need the haystack, we need lots of intelligence. But here someone's bringing the evidence to them and they're saying, no, we don't see anything there without looking into it. To me, it was somewhat remarkable because this, of course, became, but many, many, many months later, the fake elector investigation at the federal and state levels. And one of the questions I have for you is that one of the people who they went to is somebody who then plays a pretty active role in the Jack Smith investigation, an experienced Department of Justice employee. And I was wondering what you thought the reason was. It's that this wasn't picked up on. Was it that they were just so busy with the aftermath of January 6th? Was it, they just made a mistake? I mean, God knows we all do that at times, but like what's your assessment of like why that happened? Or do you relate it in any way to the scarring of the prior time? Like, why do you think this was missed? Because it really was, it was put on their desk to look at.
Well, again, you leave me with a lot of things in my mind to bring up in this book discussion. But, we are at the point, I guess if you want to think about it, this is the pivot point, right? Where Merrick Garland, the new administration, is coming in. And part of what's going on there is that they are saying Merrick Garland really recoils from the way Trump conducted himself and Trump's appointees conducted themselves atop the Justice Department, putting their finger on when they thought somebody should be prosecuted or not, or what should be the sentence that someone encounters. And so, he really wanted the investigations to go back to the way they used to be, and the best traditions of the Department of Justice, where facts bubble up from the staff, investigations, and it doesn't come by anything that Merrick Garland is saying. But these fake elector documents become kind of their own tragic bouncing ball all the way through the next year or two, because in March of 2021. This group called Americans for Prosperity, they put out I'm saying that group wrong, I think.
American
Oversight. Thank you. Very different group. American Oversight puts out the copies of these fake elector documents that they got through FOIA requests. And so they're sitting out there and people start talking about them. But the inside the U.S. Attorney's Office, they're just letting these Ryder cases bubble up and go through their course. No one is assigned to look at those fake elector documents as their own potential crime. In fact, it does go all the way through the next whole year when the House Select Committee has their people beginning to look at this. Finally, the department, I'm jumping ahead just a little bit, but to give you a sense of how important these fake elector documents become, there's a point when people inside the Department of Justice in the suite around the Attorney General realize these were the weapons left at the crime scene, and way back in December 2020, and no one really looks at them for another 15 months.
And Andrew, I think you were alluding to the fact that this was brought to J.P. Cooney, right? His team. And J.P. Cooney is a really important figure in our book in all three tragic acts, right? In the first one, he is saying, there's a reason to indict Andrew McCabe, and he's pressing his prosecutors to do that. He thinks that Andrew McCabe has lied to federal investigators. In part two, he both turned his division, I shouldn't say he personally, but his division turns down Waleska McClellan. And you asked why. We don't know why. We wish we knew why. But it seems by all accounts from these individuals that they were underwater, right? They now think there are possibly 1,000 people on January 7th that they may have to find, investigate, question, arrest, charge. So on January 8th, when they say, sorry, we're not moving, we don't see a crime here, it could be that their plate has just become the fullest they've ever imagined. It is, the riot investigation is the largest the Department of Justice ever embarked on. But it happens that the investigation into a president trying to overturn an election is perhaps, we overuse the word unprecedented, but it's impossible to say there's anything that's ever happened that is momentous.
In some ways, it's a little bit unfair on my part because, we know what happened, and so it's hard not to look backwards. But knowing that the department, as you report in your book, um, for a long time, the leadership is saying we're going to do a bottom-up investigation and we're not going to really look for connective tissue from the top going down. We're just going to wait and see if it bubbles up. But here's this piece of evidence that could have led them into the case because, as you report, um, they're seeing that this doesn't look like a grassroots problem. That this is too coordinated across states because things are looking the same, and so we know sort of what would have happened if they had pulled on this string. I wanted to sort of relate to this and move us a little bit further in the timeline. One of the things I've been doing preparing for my podcast, I was listening to Todd Blanche's conversation the other day at the Federalist Society. And he talked a lot about weaponization under the Biden administration and saying that he feels gaslit that people are talking about Trump 2.0 being a weaponized Department of Justice, saying, in his view, that there's no weaponization, but saying that there was so much during the Biden administration. And one of the things that I was wondering if you could talk about was um, having finished your book, I ended up thinking they need to read it because there's so many examples of instances, sometimes for very good reasons, sometimes maybe not, where the department is gun shy or pulling back or taking positions where an aggressive prosecutor might have been like, no, 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 we're going to do X, Y, and Z, and they're not doing it. And I think you can sort of read it two ways. One is it helps, I think, refute the argument of, pure weaponization. I'm not saying there's no instances of it, but it doesn't seem like a consistent theme for the Biden administration. On the other hand, it is also something you can read and just be like, why didn't they do X?
I think that Donald Trump, our reporting shows, benefited from, in every possible way, from a cautious, careful investigation structure inside the Department of Justice. That they really were waiting for the evidence to come up from the rioter cases to show that anybody from the Trump administration or the Trump campaign were they in contact with the actual rioters themselves. Then later on they are debating where should they go for venue in these cases, and it takes a long time to decide. And even around the midterm elections, there's this other time period when they could have. At that point in time, it's in August of 2022. They do go in and search Mar-a-Lago, and they come back with hundreds of pages of secret documents that scare the national security officials who are then looking at this and seeing they have to be put in separate vaults that, the very top rungs that people like Mary McCord weren't even authorized to see what these documents were about. And in that time period in 2022, Merrick Garland makes a decision to stop these two investigations for about 2 months because he makes a ruling that Donald Trump is now already again the de facto head of the Republican Party, and though his name isn't on the ballot that year, he is part of the Republican Party, and so we can't investigate him. We can't do any overt actions in these investigations that could sway anybody one way or the other, and as they go to the polls that November. And that was a time period when they did have more evidence to go on. They were in fact waiting to go interview Susie Wiles, now as chief of staff in the White House, because they had evidence that she had seen some of these documents.
And so, just to be clear, we're talking about the midterms, and so the typical 60-day, this informal but honored as a norm rule within the department is 60 days before an election. You don't take an overt step with respect to a candidate or a close family member of the candidate. And as you report, there's a sort of a stop work order put in place by the Attorney General, even though we're talking about the midterms where Donald Trump isn't a candidate. And not all of these steps are overt. They interviewing somebody is not an overt step unless the person, themselves makes it public. And that's sort of a sort of very protective prophylactic rule that certainly doesn't bespeak wanting to sort of go full speed ahead. It's really giving a very expansive view of, and again, I'm not saying it's wrong. It's just that it is completely inconsistent with an idea that Merrick Garland was doing something that, or at least in this instance, that was consistent with like a witch hunt, and wanting to just put his, foot on the pedal.
If
There's
anything, oh, sorry, go ahead, Aaron.
I was going to say there's a great irony in all of this, in that they do take a long time because they are very careful, cautious, take all these, prophylactic, delays. And what that ends up happening then is that Donald Trump then is indicted when becomes a candidate. And he says, well, you just waited now until I became a candidate. When in fact, it really was a product of so many other kinds of delays of system. And I think we can say, that came from a place of trying to make sure that this investigation would stand the test of time. That if somebody ever came back and looked at it, we did it the right way. It was predicated the right way. And obviously now it has led where we are.
I'd also add, oh, sorry, you go ahead, Andrew.
Well, I wonder if you could work into your answer. One of the things that struck me as another instance that was I had not seen reporting on at all was something that Aaron alluded to, which had to do with sort of the location of the Mar-a-Lago case, and also once Jack Smith is appointed, the issue of whether the department will move to recuse the Judge Cannon from the case. And I thought there was really interesting reporting about both of those things, but I think they fit the same pattern of the department not taking the most aggressive steps. And again, I'm not at this point like faulting it. I'm just pointing out what they did.
I couldn't agree more about it being similar. The thing I was going to say earlier quickly is there is no reasonable basis to say that the Biden administration or Merrick Garland's Department of Justice was weaponized against Trump. In many ways, the prosecutors who worked for Merrick Garland and adored and admired him were frustrated beyond belief that they were erring on the side of deference to a former president over and over again, and erring on the side of not having any whiff of political motivation in a way that ended up being a political choice to not, without fear or favor, treat him and the evidence implicating him in a crime the way they would someone else. But back to your question about Jack Smith, he makes first of all, we were blown away by kind of the bionic man quality of Jack Smith. He gets a fledgling election interference case that's been frozen in a little test tube and it's barely started. And he gets a pretty far advanced classified documents case. And in both, he wants to push to make a decision about indicting within 3 and eventually it's 6 months. It's kind of rocket speed in a way that I have never seen in many, many years of covering federal courts, notwithstanding that it involves a former president who's a presidential candidate. Pretty heavy stuff. He makes 2 key decisions. One is he's not going to play games with where he brings the classified documents case. He wants to base it on what is the strongest law? Where does the law urge that he has the best venue? And he concludes it's Florida after an intense legal analysis on his team. And so when he's about to bring those charges, or when he makes that decision, one of his employees, I guess you'd say, David Raskin, a prosecutor who'd prosecuted a lot of cases like this and initially had been
very experienced terrorism prosecutor, and originally from the Southern District, very smart guy, and really steeped in this. And he had actually, as you report, recently done a classified documents case. And it was one of the cases that at the time I was thinking, boy, if the case which he did is prosecuted, how could you not prosecute Donald Trump? I mean, in terms of, the department is supposed to be Aristotelian, which is you treat likes alike. And here was a much lower level person who had seemingly done much less than what Donald Trump ended up being accused of. So David Raskin has he's got all the right resume for coming to the team on that issue.
Yes, and was brought in potentially to be the trial closer because of that experience that you perfectly cite. And when he learns that Jack, his boss, is going to bring the case in Florida, he says, "You all are effing insane. If we get Cannon," essentially, that's his prefatory remark, this is an existential threat to the case. But again, Jack Smith, institutionalist, even though he's moving rapidly faster than Merrick Garland, has a much more different perspective, which is we have to answer this question for the public and for Donald Trump before we have an election. We just have a duty to do that. I'm not trying to stop him from being the president. I just know the public, the American public, needs to know the answer to this question. Is he a criminal or is he not? And he's moving apace, but he's an institutionalist in that let's not look like we're shopping for the best courtroom, the best judges that have all the experience, the jury that in DC that no doubt would indict Donald Trump. Let's do what the law urges us to do. And indeed, a national security official who works for the Department of Justice receives Jack Smith's first presentation, says, "I got one warning for you. If you get Cannon, this case is dead." And that is actually what happens. When they get Cannon and she ultimately delays and delays and delays and makes rulings that are always in Donald Trump's favor, she ultimately dismisses the case after the immunity ruling, citing a non-binding opinion, a concurrence from Justice Thomas about whether or not Jack Smith was legally named and appointed special counsel. It's a very novel way to underwrite your opinion. Nobody's ever done it before, except Judge Cannon. And Jack Smith goes to the Department of Justice when he wants to appeal her dismissal and also says, you know what, I want to appeal her dismissal and I want to move to remove her from the case because of the way she's behaved that is so out of the pale, outside the norm, and always favors.
Carol, can I just make sure people are aware of some things that go into that equation that's in your book, and some of this is sort of very public, which is that the 11th Circuit, that is the Court of Appeals over Judge Cannon, has reversed her not once but twice in connection with pretrial proceedings, and in fairly scathing ways. A friend of mine said they're not sure they would have gotten out of bed in the morning after one of those opinions. And so she has, it's not just an opinion issue in terms of like somebody thinking, oh, I don't like her rulings. This is one where a fairly conservative circuit court, the Court of Appeals in the 11th Circuit, has really chastised her twice. And now you're alluding to with the dismissal, she is the only judge who has had this issue who dismisses. Every other judge, including judges appointed by Donald Trump, or at least one judge appointed by Donald Trump in the first administration, had found that this is how you appoint special counsels, and that they'd complied with the order. So those all are sort of the fodder that he can bring to the table to say, she's wrong, Judge Cannon's wrong on the merits, but we'd also like to know whether you, the Solicitor General, will approve this, because people should know this, the special counsel is still part of the Department of Justice. So he has to go through all of the sort of normal procedures that anybody else would. You can't just move to recuse without getting that approval.
That's right. And great context, Andrew. Very important. Many people I talked to referred to the 11th Circuit overturning her the first time as an ugly smackdown. And as we now know, several of the senior judges in that courthouse tried to convince her not to take the case because of her complete lack of experience. She made rulings in which she said, essentially, there has to be the government can't look at the top secret documents that are the government's property, and that they luckily recovered from, a social club in Palm Beach. So Smith goes to the Solicitor General, a part of the Department of Justice that ultimately is supervising his case, not guiding it, but supervising it. Jack's making the decisions, no question about it. But the Solicitor General rejects his request to ask to remove Cannon, and Smith does not try to appeal that higher. He could have appealed that to the Attorney General, Merrick Garland. There are people who said that could be sticky. If he appeals it to Merrick Garland and Garland turns him down, it has to be reported to Congress per the statute of the special counsel appointment procedure. And some people also said to us, "Come on, if the Solicitor General, one of the most trusted confidants of Merrick Garland and one of his a standout legal star and one of his former law clerks rejected this, there was very little chance in heck that Merrick Garland was going to overturn her."
So I have a question that and Aaron, I'm sorry to pose this to Carol because I've asked you this question in another forum, which is I was really interested in what is the biggest question that you weren't able to answer, like that you sort of were like, that this is what I'd still like to know, that I haven't been able to either get any source or any source that I could for reporting purposes that was, sufficiently credible and corroborated, that I still would like to know the answer to.
I have a lot of respect, professional respect, watching the careers of Merrick Garland and Lisa Monaco. And I wish that I had been in a room or they had let me into a room where they had a discussion in January of 2022 about why they were launching a probe that of the fake electors finally. It was we know and we report for the first time that the moment that they began the probe of fake electors and began Thomas Windham, the lone prosecutor, the one prosecutor that has been assigned by the Department of Justice, reaches out to Waleska McClellan asking her to join a fake elector probe and telling her she'd be the first on board because he can't get the FBI to join him at that point. That happens, hours, maybe 48 hours after there is a lot of publicity about how much the House Select Committee has learned about a coordinated fake elector probe. And that is very embarrassing to the Department of Justice. I wish I had been in a room where the two of them made the decision to no longer base a probe on what we learned brick by brick going up from the riot probe, but base it on the predicate of the things Waleska McClellan learned in December 2020. How did they make that decision when before Merrick Garland over and over again said the only fair way to do this is from the bottom to the top?
It's so interesting. So, by the way, just spoiler alert, so you and Aaron obviously know each other, because that was a very similar answer to Aaron. And I have to say, reading it, that was one of the big questions I had, was sort of like, what explains that switch? There's such remarkable reporting that you have a challenge to, and so before we turn to, you have a challenge in terms of what to continue investigating, because you're so dogged, both of you, that I'm sure we will get to that. Before we turn to questions, I did want to ask you about something that I kind of found jaw-dropping, and that is when the Department of Justice, through Jay Bratt, who is the lead investigator, sort of Jack Smith, is trying to negotiate and get the documents back before they do the search. They're trying to do everything to try and get these documents back from Mar-a-Lago. There's a part of the book where you report that there are documents that get on a plane with Donald Trump in Florida and go off on that plane, which I think is the first time. I had never read that before. And I was like, Oh my God. And that we know a lot about what happened at Mar-a-Lago, at least what's alleged by Jack Smith. But this is the first time that the fear that I think people in the national security world and the intelligence world have is what's happening to the documents and who has eyes on them and how secure are they, and are they getting into the wrong hands? And you have this report that they are actually being bundled onto a plane. Could you tell us about that part of the story?
Sure. There are just some scenes that I think I was even surprised we were able to get in the course of this reporting, and credit to my colleague here for some of this reporting. But we were able to figure out that there was a day when Jay Bratt and was heading down to Mar-a-Lago with FBI agents, and they were going to collect everything to that point in time. The Trump administration, or former Trump administration, his aides said, "This is everything. We're handing back everything we've got." And they meet Donald Trump in like a darkened ballroom, and he has this encounter with them where, he's makes small talk and says, if they introduce themselves, "Who are you with?" He's like, "FBI, DOJ." Like, "Oh," he says, "Great reputation," says the president, and kind of jokes, "I'm an open book. Anything you guys need." And as he's saying that, there are actually SUVs, government SUVs, that are heading in the opposite direction from where Jay Bratt just came from, the airport, with boxes that text messages show that, Melania and the president and his aides were deciding which ones, some were going to be heading to Bedminster for the summer with them. And so the very boxes that become the center of the search later on, some of them have already left, and left the very day that the FBI is there meeting with Trump face to face.
Remarkable. So let's turn to some of the audience questions. Uh, let me just quickly look through them. One of the questions that I thought was really interesting was, what surprised you the most? What in the course of your reporting did you think, not just, oh, I suspected that happened and we were able to confirm it, but you were surprised to learn?
I think some of the things you hit on, Andrew, are in my big holy moly, we got to get this in the book bucket. Waleska McClellan's moment where she tries to get the DOJ to look at this and gets turned down so early. I think the getting inside Jack Smith's operation and the speed with which he was working, the incredible physical damage that has been done to him when he is appointed special counsel in a bike accident, and what he goes through to be special counsel and to speed those cases forward. It's just that he's an Iron Man. So I guess I need to practice being an Iron Man more, because the determination that he brings is that same kind of thing. Sure, I can run 26 miles and swim 2 and bike 100 in the same day. That was also a shocker to me.
I would say, oh yeah, just in a different kind of way, I was surprised at how we kept learning how much politics had impacted not just the upper rungs of the Department of Justice, but some of the lower rungs. And there's a point not too long after January 6th when the prosecutors in DC, and it was very different the way that the prosecutors handled and the FBI handled the investigation of January 6th. All of the prosecutors were in DC, and the agents were all over the country. And so you had to pair up agents somewhere in the country with a prosecutor in DC, and there's an ambulance going by if you hear in the background here in DC. But they started picking up on these agents not wanting to always go out and conduct the interviews or to effectuate the arrest of one of the rioters. And this is really happening as Donald Trump's ascendancy is he's returning to power, returning to prominence, and a lot of the talking points on the right are that this is a witch hunt to try to find people and Trump is beginning to rewrite the narrative of January 6th. And they begin they get to a point where every time they start their morning meeting in the Department of Justice, the U.S. Attorney's Office, okay, who's having problems with the FBI? And it's almost always turns out to be in red states. And they are having to create this triage system where recalcitrant agents, they, have their bosses, go out and do that interview, get the investigation done. And so there was tension and political tension that was permeating through the whole department.
That was so interesting to me because one of the things I experienced going from being a lawyer at Main Justice to moving to the FBI was, and that was under Robert Mueller as the director, was how palpably nonpartisan and apolitical it is. And reading your reporting and obviously seeing, what's happened more recently, you realize how much, no matter how strong an institution, it's made up of people and that can all go away. One of the questions relates to this, which is the question is now that the book is out, and it obviously has, you have to stop your clock to put the book out. But what would be if you were going to like have it like you talked about it, I think, Carol, in terms of three acts. How do you see like what's going on and what would be the additional chapter that you would be sort of interested in having been able to have as a capstone or to write in terms of seeing the arc of your story?
Oh, I definitely know the answer to that. My unofficial chapter or part title for that would be called The Resistance. There's a moment in the book where Brian Driscoll, the acting FBI director before Kaj Patel is confirmed, is wrangling and fighting with acting Deputy Attorney General Emile Beauvais, a lieutenant for Donald Trump and his former defense lawyer in his criminal cases. The two of them are having a battle royale because Beauvais wants to purge FBI agents at the encouragement of Stephen Miller and, we're told, Kaj Patel, who isn't even the FBI director yet. And Driscoll won't give him the names, will not give him the names of all the agents, which number in the thousands, who were involved in the January 6th investigation. And Beauvais turns to him and says, you just gave me these identifying numbers instead of names. This feels like resistance. And Driscoll says, because it is. The next chapter, I think, would be diving into the human beings that I know are forming a resistance to the Beauvais that have come behind him after he was appointed to the Third Circuit Appellate Court. They are resisting the efforts by Donald Trump and his lieutenants to bring cases that they know are improper, factually flawed, and politically driven. And that resistance is very alive, and it takes a lot of different forms, and it's visceral and important.
Aaron, do you have an answer in terms of where it's in many ways it's sort of what do you see going on now, and how do you tie that to the trajectory of the first term and then the Biden administration?
Yeah. Well, our editor, when we did finally turn in the book, she said, just turn it in. There's going to be no good place to end this book. Every day is going to be a new outrage. And so, and it's true. We could have kept writing every day and every week something new.
It's like Scheherazade. Right?
Yeah. Obviously, the Comey indicting the former FBI director is a really big, important moment that, everything we were writing in the book led to that, where you got to a place where a prosecution could be made, an indictment could be sought for very thin evidence, and, that career staff had turned down and would not go forward with. I do think there's another chapter that we're all going to live through now, which is what does the judiciary do in this next round? And, how much of a firewall do we still have there? And I don't know what the answer to that is going to be.
So, Carol, I know that you, in addition to having written this book about the department, also are steeped in other institutions in Washington. And I was wondering what your take is and level of either optimism or cynicism is with respect to, is there a way to get back to normal? Can these institutions rebound? And can norms that are previously what we realize has held them together, absent, as Aaron said, the courts being that backstop, if we got to an administration that was, um, again, with taking it politics aside, sort of like in what I'll call a normal Republican or normal Democratic administration. I've served in, I think every single one for the last, over 20 years. But for Trump, there were just norms that were adhered to. I always tell the story of working on the Enron case, which was under the Bush administration, and there was not a snowball's chance in hell that the White House was going to interfere with that over Larry Thompson, the then acting Attorney General's word. I mean, there was just complete normalcy in terms of how that was done. So I just want to make sure sort of people understand this sort of apolitical quality. Do you think we ever can get back there, or is this really, it's been broken and there will always be this model of that people can mimic and use to undermine it again and again?
Well, if we're just talking about the Justice Department, whether we can get that back to normal, I'm just going to rely heavily on the sources that trusted Aaron and me, and we are indebted to them, even the ones that were kind of reluctant. Most of them were pretty reluctant to talk to us, but we're indebted to them for letting us in to what they went through and the decisions they struggled with. And what so many of them have said to us is the American people have to wake up. The part of the reason they spoke to us is they wanted Americans to recognize that rule of law is not an academic term that we just talk about in your NYU classes. It makes a huge difference in whether or not you are fairly treated by our justice system, and you are not going to be arrested and rounded up just because you got on the wrong side or drew the ire of Donald Trump. And so the American people, the average person, has to care about this and make that known. But the other thing our sources have said to us over and over again is there are people that want that this is a calling to be in this institution. It is a passion to turn down $1 to $10 million a year at a private law firm and serve as a representative of the United States of America. And there's a shared mission and shared values and an integrity that undergirds these decisions that they've all made together, that they learned in the honors program and they learned from all their supervisors, you included. And they are determined to not give up that ghost and to rebuild. So we have that to hope for.
I have a question for you that I was sort of always fascinated by. So both of you are, you write a book and you're both also reporters in your so-called day job. And how do you decide, like, how do you balance that? Because let's say you get information that's sort of, newsworthy, and God knows this book is just it's from beginning to end. I mean, it's just such a great book and it's such a good read. But there's so much new information and then put into the context that we know, but then so much that's new. How do you make the decision? What goes for the book, what gets reported on a day-to-day basis, and then who's part of that decision? Is it just, do individual reporters make it? Do you make it with your book editor, with your publisher, like your where you work? So if you're at the Washington Post, which both of you were at for so many years, how is that? Who's sort of in the room to make that, or is it just really left up to the individual good judgment of each reporter?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. We obviously, as an industry, as a before the state, we don't want to be accused of holding something back that could have a meaningful impact on an election or how people perceive a candidate. And so, you know, those books, the books that are written and people are out there reporting a book and writing newspaper articles in the months before an election, it's pretty fraught, right? Because you are learning things that could all make for good stories in a book, and but you have a certain duty to report that out as well. Carol and I had some benefit of good timing on this to a degree, and that is that it was last March. I remember, several 5, 6 months before the election, where Carol and I had just been at the Hoover Building, and our editor called and said, we're just not going to be able to write this. We're not going to be able to publish this before the election. In fact, she said, "Sit down because I want to tell you something." And so we sat down, and I was hoping it would come out before the election, and because I felt like the things we were uncovering about the first Trump term and how it was worse than you thought, and how how much slower this investigation went than it could have made it for all a good story by itself. But our editor said, we're just not going to know the consequence of all these things until after the election. And did all these delays add up to, an impact? And so Carol and I got the next day, we both went back to work at the Washington Post and worked our, butts off through the election. And then when the election was done and we saw that Trump had won, we said bye again and went back on book leave. And so we didn't have to make that decision to really on a day-to-day basis. There was one story where Carol and I had a tip, and this was about the Egypt case, which we detail in the book. That one we were working on when we were leaving, and that one they wouldn't let us out the door without saying, if you nail that story, you need to come back and put that in the Washington Post, not in the book. It can't appear in the book first. And so we did talk about that. We did agree to that, and Carol and I spent an inordinate amount of time nailing down the story of 2 bags full of cash that leave, a bank branch in Cairo 5 days before Trump is inaugurated the first time back in 2016 and 2017, and how the Justice Department stopped from ever looking to see if that money ever showed up in Trump's bank account.
Since the book has been published, this is the last question that we have. This goes so fast. I could just, as you know, I could just keep asking you tons and tons of questions, and there are wonderful questions from the audience. So thanks, everybody. The last question is, since the book has come out, have you gotten feedback either from the White House or anyone at the Department of Justice about the book? Anything, they think is fair or unfair about the reporting?
Sadly, reporters love feedback, even if it's a fire hose pointed at our heads. We want to hear when people are critical,
Yeah.
and wanted many, many months ago to hear from the White House and the current Justice Department about what they thought about our findings. And sadly, it's been very quiet, very little response. And I'm not entirely sure why, other than obviously we feel pretty solid that all of our information's accurate, documented, corroborated multiple ways. I would love to hear what Donald Trump thinks about the book, and would love to hear what Pam Bondi thinks, but really, really nothing from them, Andrew.
Well, you've certainly heard from me and others about how much we just are so benefited from your reporting and your tenacity. And it's such a terrific read. It's told in a really dispassionate way. It feels very much like an FBI product, an old FBI product, which is just the facts, and recounting what it is. And it feels so solid in terms of, and knowing the two of you, this is not one where you're going to there's a lot of adjectives and guesswork. It just reads so beautifully. And it's, as somebody who really cares about the historical record and reporting that indicates like what happened, and we have that for generations. It's such a service to the country. I cannot recommend it more highly to people. It's a terrific read. I know the book is titled Injustice. I don't think I have done it justice in trying to capture this in such a short period of time. But thank you both very, very much. You can buy the book, with millions of different places, and I encourage you to do that, or I'm an Ex Libris fan, so you can borrow it from libraries. But it's the kind of thing you might want to have it, because there's a lot of different. It's really dense, so it's great to be able to have it and look back on it. I know I do. So thank you very much, and we thank the Commonwealth Club's efforts to do this and put it together, this virtual event. And if you want to know more about the Commonwealth Club, you can go to commonwealthclub.org. I'm Andrew Weissman, and thank you. And thanks everybody for staying engaged. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you, Andrew.